I'm Allison Johnjack, the Cranberry Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. These videos are the on-demand recordings of UW Extension and the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association's virtual brown bag lunch series. These monthly sessions offer growers and researchers a way to share timely and relevant information. We hope you'll enjoy and continue to engage with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grant Holly. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. We are very happy to be able to partner with UW Extension to bring you the research needed to be able to navigate our ever-changing environment. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for their valuable time and leadership, the growers for joining us, and Allison for being the catalyst from which all of these sessions rely. Thank you so much.
So good morning and transitioning over to good afternoon, everyone, as we begin our March 21st, 2025 Cranberry Virtual Brown Bag. We are, as usual, in the growing season, we focus on agronomic topics, and in the non-growing season, or the ice is almost off, or the surprise snowstorm last night season, we get to hear from some of our other experts. So today we're going to have Katie Gantus, the horticultural advisor of the Cranberry Institute, as well as Chris Schlechta, the safety and loss control manager for Rural Mutual Insurance Company. Katie is going to go over a lot of IR4 and new pesticide updates with us, and then Chris is going to go over farm exemptions, farm non-exemptions, CDL, trucking equipment versus sand versus crop, and all these other kinds of questions. So I'm really grateful for both of their expertise. Is Grant with us today to give a quick welcome from the Growers Association? If not, I will give a quick welcome both from UW-Madison Division of Extension, who supports our virtual brown bags, as well as all other kind of grower outreach and professional development. The Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association supports us as well. And in terms of housekeeping, if we have questions over the course of the session, since Katie's topics and Chris's topics are a little bit different, we're probably going to have separate Q&A for Katie after Katie's session, and then Q&A for Chris after Chris's session. If you have questions, either feel free to unmute yourself and ask. You can type a question into the chat, or you can use the drop down to say, ask this question to Allison John, and then I can ask that question anonymously on your behalf. There are transcripts, and if you need to view those transcripts, there's that ... more, and you can turn on the closed captions. And other than that, if you want to keep yourself muted unless you are asking a question, I think we're good to dive in, and I will stop sharing my screen. And Chris, I see your screen. That looks great.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Schlechta. I'm the Safety and Loss Control Manager with Rural Mutual Insurance. So I lead a team of safety professionals that we've got spread throughout the state. And really what our role is just being a resource to our insured. So appreciate the opportunity to come in today and talk a little bit about some of the questions on ag commercial motor vehicles versus commercial motor vehicles. And we had a couple other questions that kind of came in on various exceptions and exemptions that apply to farms. So I'm just going to kind of run through this. We've got about 20 minutes to do this, and some of these things could really go down some pretty deep rabbit holes. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask those at the end if there's something that I can't answer. And we had a great question come in a little bit earlier that I had just enough time to do some research on to make sure I had mostly a correct answer. We'll get to that one, but also provide you with my contact information, just that you can follow up if there's something that's kind of a unique situation that you're dealing with. And you're kind of curious as to maybe how it applies. One of the things I always like to kind of put the big caveat in there, and when we're talking about exceptions and exemptions, and this is no different, is it all kind of depends on what the actual activity is that you're doing, not who you are. And this applies to whether it's driving vehicles, driving licenses, whether it's OSHA related, and some of the other regulatory and fire codes that are out there. I always tell the fun story when it comes to this of years ago, I was a trainer for providing safety instruction for a variety of municipalities to include police departments. So as a certified emergency vehicle operator trainer, and we would talk with our police officers about, just basic rules of the road. And so we talk about things like making sure you wear your safety belt, right? And one of my first classes, I had an officer raise his hand. He goes, "No, you can skip past that. We're exempt from that." And I kind of stopped a little bit and kind of laughed. I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, which one of the laws of physics are you guys exempt from?" And he kind of chuckled a little bit, and then he kind of looked at me seriously. I said, "No, really." I said, "At the end of the day, yes, there is an exemption that's out there. But there are times where you do want to make sure that you follow what the generally accepted practice is, even if you don't have a regulatory requirement to do it." And I'll kind of dip into a couple of those things as we go along. Just understanding that, yeah, sometimes there is an exception or an exemption that may apply in that case. But sometimes, especially when it comes to safety, sometimes doing it a certain generally accepted way, maybe that isn't legally or regulatory applied to you as a farm, still might be the better way to go about it. So kind of as we dig into this, I want to kind of get into some of the definitions and these are really the key part. So when we talk about ag commercial motor vehicles versus a commercial motor vehicle and whether a CDL is required or a CDL is not required, kind of what's a farm activity versus not farm, kind of general industry, if you will, or for hire trucking. When you talk with the state of Wisconsin, there's kind of two different departments that oversee this aspect of it. So first one is Department of Transportation, which is kind of the all-encompassing amorphous. Not only do we apply with the definition of the type of vehicle it is, but then we also have the licensing piece of it. And then a subset of the DOT is the Wisconsin State Patrol as an enforcement mechanism with that. And even within those two different groups, there's some little gray areas that we'll kind of touch on in terms of what one group might look at versus the other group might work at. A couple months ago, we had Lieutenant Bill Berger with Wisconsin State Patrol come in and do a training session for all of our underwriters and safety and loss control folks. And it was interesting because there was a lot of things that were brought up that were kind of some of the questions that were brought forward as part of this presentation that I was asked to answer and things that we had kind of assumed like we knew the answer for. And as the lieutenant was talking about some of the different things, he was talking about what the direct application was or what the direct use was, not necessarily what the underlying condition was. And we'll kind of break that down a little bit with some of the questions that are in here. So when we talk about the definitions of it, a commercial motor vehicle, I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. That's a vehicle typically that, depending on size, it's usually 26,000 pounds or more. Or it's got a combined total of 26,000 pounds with a trailer behind it being 10,000 pounds or more. So you might have a situation where somebody's got an F-250, F-350, and they're pulling a heavy trailer or a trailer with a piece of equipment on it that they're exceeding that 10,000 pounds so that their combined trailer is 10,000 plus, and then the combined total is 26,000, pushes them over that threshold into the commercial motor vehicle threshold. Could be something where it's passenger directed. So we've seen times where somebody will buy a school bus and they're using that for transporting employees around. Keep in mind, if the capacity is 15 or more, so you buy a 15 passenger van, it is now a commercial motor vehicle if you're transporting employees in it. You buy a 12 passenger van, it's not. Or you buy a 15 passenger van and you take a seat out, where it physically removes the seat to fall under that threshold. So those are some of the criteria. And then the last one that's on there is the hazardous materials hauling. From time to time, we do see this on the farms, and particularly with fertilizers. You might see a farmer buys a tank, they strap it to the back of a straight truck, and they're hauling it around. And depending on what that chemical is, the DOT requirements specify whether or not it has to be placarded. So it's got the little warning triangles or little warning diamonds, excuse me, on the back side of it, whether it's flammable or corrosive, or maybe it's a mixed load where you've got a couple of different chemicals and it's just simply a dangerous, placard that's on there. If the vehicle is carrying chemicals in a quantity that require it to be placarded, that now falls under that commercial motor vehicle statute. So regardless if you're using it for, farming activities or you're hauling those things, you're going to start butting up against that commercial motor vehicle definition. So then what is an ag commercial motor vehicle? It is all of the things that we just described of a commercial motor vehicle. However, it's being used for some very specific activities related to farming. And when I say very specific, this is where you're going to see a little bit of a parting of the ways in terms of opinions on what the DOT provides for a regulatory framework versus what State Patrol might look at from an enforcement perspective. And I'm going to add this additional caveat in here. There's a third leg to this is from an insurance company, we may permit things that are different than these. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. You come to us and you say, "Hey, Chris, we've got this fleet of vehicles. These are all farm vehicles." Okay, great. We're going to schedule those as a farm vehicle. You're using them for farming purposes. From an insurance perspective, we're not really getting into the weeds worrying about whether or not you're moving into that commercial motor vehicle versus staying in the ag side of it. We're insuring vehicles based on what you've told us and what you've provided to us. Now, the state of Wisconsin DOT, from a registration standpoint, might be different from that. State Patrol might be different from that. And some of the other things we'll talk about in a minute here, too. State statute provides the insurance company, outside of the motor vehicle side of it, to make some exceptions on some things, too. So, but as it relates to the motor vehicle side of it, you bring your schedule of vehicles to one of our agents and say, "Hey, these are all our farm vehicles." We're just going to schedule them as such. We're not getting into the weeds of whether it's an ag commercial motor vehicle or whether it's a commercial motor vehicle. So on the ag definition, again, it is a commercial motor vehicle, but now it's being specifically used for an agricultural use. Either it was brought right off the manufacturer assembly line, designed for that use, or it was modified after the fact for that use. And we'll see that sometimes where you've got different pieces of equipment that are unique. Cranberry obviously is probably one of the more unique farming operations. Some of the equipment is wholeheartedly custom built just for a cranberry operation. Some of the booms that are out there and some of the other planting vehicles that are out there, you won't see in any other industry. They don't come off a manufacturing line. A lot of times they're custom built right there on the farm. So the statute, when it starts looking at that, it defines that as an ag motor vehicle if it's also highway capable. So that's the next point that's on there. It has to be designed and manufactured for highway use. So a planting vehicle, for example, it's not necessarily designed to drive down the highway. Could you drive it down the highway? Sure, it's got wheels on it, it'll move. But does it have turn signals? Does it have crash protection? Does it have all those things that the federal law requires for basically a highway capable vehicle? So the answer would be no in those cases. That now kind of pushes it into the implements of husbandry side. We'll talk about that in just a second. So the next criteria is it has to be manufactured after 1970. It's got those safety methods or those safety protections that are as part of it. And it has to be used exclusively for the conduct of agricultural operations. It can't be used out on a farm today and then tomorrow suddenly it's a commercial motor vehicle and we're running it for higher loads across the United States. So it really has to be specific for that ag industry aspect of it. And then the next point here is this is where the Department of Transportation really dials it in terms of defining things. And they're very, very specific on this. So one of them is it has to be for directly distributing feed to livestock or for directly applying fertilizer, lime, spray, or seeds, but not manure to a farm field. The application in the cranberry side of things too is, it could be something where it's a planting aspect or a harvesting aspect, or they talk about the applying of fertilizer. So that would be that one. The next one gets into the planting and the harvesting piece of it. So it's either assisting another vehicle, it's directly harvesting product, or it is the harvesting or planting vehicle itself. They talk about planting potatoes and such, but again, the correlation could be pretty direct with the cranberry industry, of the planting and the harvesting aspect of it. The last one is they talk about for applying manure to a farm field or for offloading the manure if field conditions don't permit for manure application. So, you see a dairy farmer, a crop farmer might have a temporary tank set up on the roadway that they're dumping into. So they're very specific in talking about that it's that direct application to the farm field or taking something directly from the farm field. So on the cranberry side of it, it could be the direct application of fertilizer, it could be the direct planting, or it could be the direct harvesting activity. So when you think about it in that context, that's what the Wisconsin DOT looks like. So then you start getting into all these other areas, and I've got kind of a list of questions I'll kind of run through, kind of breaking that down and talking about each one of those three elements. So that's on the ag commercial motor vehicle. So now we go to the next part of it is the implements of husbandry, and what the state definition under the DOT is for that. So their definition, they break it into three different categories. So category A vehicle is a farm tractor. Category B vehicle is a farm tractor with something bolted onto it that, it's got, different collection heads on it. It's got different attachments on it, not trailers, but just different attachments bolted to it for any number of reasons, fertilizers, weed control, harvesting, planting, any of those things. And then category C is anything that's basically being towed in terms of the farm application of it. So when you think of those implements of husbandry, it's farm tractors, basically farm tractors with everything bolted to it that's needed for, application of fertilizer, plants, harvesting, all of those types of things. And then the last one is anything that's involving towing a vehicle that's in support of that farming activity. And so these might be vehicles like a cranberry planter that's not necessarily designed to be on the roadway, but it falls under that implements of husbandry definition. And for the cranberry industry, it's kind of a little bit, of a wonky term when you talk about implements of husbandry. We talk about husbandry in terms of animals. Obviously, we don't have animals on a cranberry farm, or maybe a couple of pets running around. But that's how the state will look at that when they apply those types of definitions to it. So now here's where I threw a variety of questions together to really just kind of dig into some of these definitions. So we've got what the Department of Transportation will apply as a definition to the vehicle. And then you've got what the Wisconsin State Patrol will define it from an enforcement perspective. And really, it gets down to what the activity is, not necessarily the vehicle itself. So DOT is looking at weights of the vehicle and how that vehicle is used, whereas the State Patrol is looking specifically at the activity that's involved into there. And it was interesting, even when we had Lieutenant Berger was kind of going through some of these things, one of the comments he made, he goes, we'll basically stand on the side of the road and it's a judgment call at that point of what is this thing being used for? Is this thing being used for commercial transportation, for hire transportation, or is it being used in support of the farm? And sometimes that's basically the only litmus test that they apply to it. One of the questions that Allison had received, and this was a great question. I had to stop and think this one through from a couple of different layers. Allison, do you have that question that you can read off just to make sure we encapsulate the whole question there?
Absolutely. The question was, can a non-CDL operator drive a truck with a commercial plate in a farm exempt setting on the highway?
So this is a great question because it covers three areas. What is the driver licensed for? What is the vehicle licensed for? And then what is the activity? So the interesting part of this is it all falls back to the activity. What is that thing being used for? Because again, at the end of the day, State Patrol is going to be the one that's going to be making this decision. And the direction that we're given is basically they make that objective decision on the side of the road. Is this thing being used for farming application, or is it being used in a for hire type situation where it's a commercial motor vehicle? I even had to check with our underwriters on this one because I wasn't sure on the scheduling of whether it was a farm vehicle or a commercial vehicle. And again, from an insurance perspective, it doesn't matter. When I looked at the state of Wisconsin didn't have really much to say specifically on that from the DOT perspective. However, the Federal Motor Carrier Standards Act did have a section in there specifically addressing farms that said basically it's whatever that use is for a vehicle if it's less than 10,000 pounds. So you might have a pickup truck that's used in a for hire basis that now is being used for farming. The Federal Motor Carrier Act is stating that if it's over 10,000 pounds, it's just considered a commercial motor vehicle and it does require a CDL. State of Wisconsin seems to have a slightly different perspective on that, where it's the end use. So even if it's not a commercial motor vehicle, they're looking at was it being used in the pursuit of farming? Back to those questions. Are we applying something to the fields? Are we pulling something off of the fields? We don't deal with the manure aspect of it, the cranberry side. So that's how they're looking at it. Clear as mud, I know. But this is one of the things too, where when you get these different agencies where you have a regulatory agency, you have an enforcement agency, you have a state level and federal level, there can be some questions as far as what the ultimate opinion is going to be. I guess, and this is just my personal opinion, is at the end of the day, I'm going to be looking to see what the state patrol says because they're going to be the ones writing the ticket if you're not in compliance with it. Based on the input that we've got from them, again, it goes back to that activity. If it's being used in the farm use, it's going to be an exempted activity. It would be considered an ag commercial motor vehicle. A CDL would not necessarily be required in that situation. So back to that question, regardless of how it's plated, it's that end activity. So the end activity is an activity that does not require a CDL, so that non-CDL driver is perfectly fine operating that vehicle in that particular situation. One of the questions that we get that comes up, especially on the Cranberry side of things, is hauling sand. And this is, again, kind of an interesting one. So, again, insurance perspective is a little bit different necessarily than what maybe the DOT perspective is. You come to us and say, hey, schedule this as a farm vehicle. That's the way that we're handling it. When you start looking at the regulatory framework of how they look at things, again, going through and spoke with a gentleman, Roger, over at Wisconsin DOT that's in their permitting area. So he's kind of one of the gentlemen that makes those judgment calls of what is a commercial vehicle versus what's an ag commercial motor vehicle. And again, going back to that very specific definition of a commercial motor vehicle and an ag commercial motor vehicle, you look at hauling sand. So you're taking a dump truck, you're going to, maybe it's your pit, maybe it's another pit down the road, and you're purchasing it, you're bringing it back to the marsh, you're spreading it with basically a spreader on the back of the vehicle. When you start looking at the definitions of it, if you're traversing the roadway, that is by definition a commercial motor vehicle and by definition would require a CDL. Again, that's the Wisconsin Department of Transportation's opinion on that, or their interpretation, I should say, not opinion. Wisconsin DOT, again, or excuse me, Wisconsin State Patrol, again, based on the direction we are given from them, would probably look at this and say, hey, you're hauling sand back, you're applying it on a farm field. They're not getting as deep in the weeds of is it a nutrient and is it not a nutrient? Is it, harvest product, not a harvest product? They're just using the application that it's a farm. The same could hold true for a dairy farm. They're hauling sand back for bedding of the cattle. So that's where you're going to see maybe a little bit of a disconnect from a regulatory standpoint. I don't have a clear answer because even at the state level, two different agencies have different perspectives on the response to that question. So whether you're, bringing it from the pit back to the farm, I think there is one area that a lot of them would fall in that if you're bringing it back and you're storing it, you're not directly applying it to the field. There could be a greater gap in there where they look at it and say, okay, this is a commercial motor vehicle. It does require a CDL because it's not being directly applied to the field. You're hauling it back and forth for storage. Hauling building materials to the farm or to the marsh. This is one actually that the State Patrol mentioned specifically that, they see from time to time where a farm might have a semi-tractor and a lowboy that they're using for hauling equipment out to the field. That would be a permissible ag CMV activity, hauling equipment from the farm to the field. But if you go into town and you're hauling building materials back to build a structure on the farm, they would not look at that as a ag protected activity. They would look at that as you're hauling materials and it's a commercial motor vehicle activity that would then require a CDL. Hauling equipment back from the farm or back to the farm after you purchase it at an auction or a dealer. State Patrol would also lean towards looking at that as a commercial motor vehicle activity as opposed to an ag activity and would require a CDL in a situation like that. Hauling fruit to a storage facility on behalf of your neighbor is a favor. You're not exchanging money. We hear this all the time. We'll ask, hey, do you do any custom operations for others? And, we'll get the answer, no, not really. But, if, Mike's tractor breaks down the road, we're going to go over and give him a hand. That's just what we do in Wisconsin. From an insurance perspective, we don't really care. We don't handle it any differently. State of Wisconsin DOT, if you start doing something on behalf of another, even if you're not exchanging compensation, they view that as a for hire activity in which a commercial motor vehicle application would be used. Hauling fruit to a non-owned storage facility 68 miles away. That's a protected activity under the ag commercial motor vehicle. Hauling a fruit to a non-owned storage facility 8 miles away, but it's across the state line. Well, now we've changed things. Now we're crossing a state line. Now that falls under the Federal Motor Carrier Standards Act. That falls under the commercial motor vehicle, aspect of Wisconsin's laws. Which state you're going into as far as an adjoining state, I couldn't begin to tell you what their rules and regulations are as it relates to ag. They're probably all a little bit different. So then the next one is you're hauling that fruit to a non-owned storage facility that's 168 miles away versus 68. In this case, now what you're doing is you're exceeding that 150 air mile radius, which is what they have specified in the state law as a difference between an ag commercial motor vehicle and a commercial motor vehicle. So regardless of what the activity is, you're hauling it from your field. If you're taking it to a storage facility that's not your farm, not another location of your farm, you're taking it to market, and you exceed that 150 miles, now you're automatically considered a commercial motor vehicle at that standpoint. And you're going to have a CDL and follow all of those particular requirements. Maybe you're hauling fruit from one non-owned storage location to another. State Patrol is probably going to look at that as a commercial motor vehicle activity because it's not originating or ending on the farm. You're going from one storage facility that's not at the farm to another storage facility, even if it's your product. They still look at that as a commercial motor vehicle activity. Let's say you haul something, to a storage facility, you take it to market, and you're coming back, and somebody's like, "Hey, can you stop and pick up XYZ?" Something like that, where you're now hauling for somebody else, again, regardless of whether or not compensation was exchanged. If you're hauling 142 miles to market and then you come back, excuse me, and you're hauling something for somebody else, you're now considered a commercial motor vehicle at that standpoint. So the ag CMV protections do not apply, or should say exemptions don't apply. One of the pieces that I threw in here too, so that when you pull this up later, is I've got a reference to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. Has a Farm Service commercial driver's license that you can get. And what this is it's kind of that half a step between an ag commercial motor vehicle and a commercial motor vehicle. And by half a step, I mean that there are still some exceptions that are granted. So you can't operate more than 210 days in a year under this farm CDL. There are some additional requirements too, where it moves you closer on things such as operating under the influence. So, as a commercial motor vehicle driver, state of Wisconsin, blood alcohol content, prohibited blood alcohol content is 0.08. If you own a CDL, regardless if you're driving that CDL or not, your blood alcohol prohibited content is 0.04. That now carries down if you're operating as a farm service commercial driver. Where this farm service CDL comes more into play is typically going to be like your co-ops and some of your other businesses, your custom operators that are operating in support of a farm, but they don't actually, it's not their farm. They're kind of that little intermediary where it's not really truly a commercial vehicle, only because they don't own the farm. So that's where that kind of little half step piece of it came in. So kind of an interesting read if you go through and look at that when you have time. So beyond the vehicle side of it, again, really look at what that use of it is. If it's in support of the farm, that's something that's going to be a protected activity generally from an enforcement perspective. If it's not, that's something that's going to fall under that commercial motor vehicle and then require a commercial driver's license as part of that. Some of the things that we see for farm exemptions that are out there, probably the most common one we see is farm buildings. So the commercial building code starting at chapter 361 is kind of the construction design aspect of it. That is something that farms are exempted from following that on the ag building construction side of things, meaning you don't have to have a state inspector come out, you don't have to submit plans for a building, you don't have to have it permitted through the state. You're also exempted from some of the things such as snow and wind loading. I will say this though, from the insurance company perspective, if we look at a building and it's pretty obvious that it's not constructed that standard, it could be something that could be impacting the ability of the insurance company to provide coverage for snow and wind and collapse coverage on that building. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're putting up new buildings. We're also starting to see more and more contractors are really following the snow wind design piece of it when they're constructing an ag building. Because quite frankly, what's happened is they've gotten pulled into court multiple times by different insurance companies and they're tired of it. So they're making kind of some of those design things to be able to withhold the snow loading and stuff for parts of Wisconsin. So functionally, that's really the biggest thing that we tend to see. Sometimes beams structures as far as support structures. Again, this is one of those things too, from an insurance perspective, if we come out and it's got a particularly long span that's not supported or it's a smaller beam that's used, we may have to roll back some of the coverage that we can provide for that. But state of Wisconsin doesn't have specific requirements on some of that stuff. What they do have, though, is even if the building structure is exempted from permitting and some of the design piece of it, they are still fall under the electric code. They do still fall under the plumbing code, and they do still fall under the HVAC code as it specifically rates to human occupancy. So potable water, for example, versus water used for the animals, or electrical in general will apply in an ag building. So some of those codes have to be followed on there as well. One of the other big ones we see is OSHA. I hear a lot of people like, hey, we're a farm, we're exempt from OSHA. Yes and no. So OSHA standards, they have 1910 is what they call the general industry standard, and that's the one that everybody's most familiar with. That covers everything, A to Z, whether it's fall protection or chemical safety or personal protective equipment or all of the things that you typically think of that are OSHA safety related. 1928 is the farm standard, and it is probably the thinnest standard out of all of the OSHA regulations that were out of there. Most of the stuff in there doesn't even apply to current day farms because it was more geared towards heavy equipment that was used back in the day. Like they've got a chapter on gin mills, or cotton gins, stuff that isn't even typically used in the way that it was designed back in the day. What they do have, though, is there are some certain standards that do apply. So rollover protection, for example, on tractors is part of the 1928 standard. The one thing that most people don't realize is that even though they're under the 1928 standard, there's this thing called the General Duty Clause that is part of the original OSHA Act that was put out. And that General Duty Clause basically states that if an employer has a reasonable understanding that there is a hazard presented to an employer, the employer has to take steps to mitigate that hazard or prevent that employee from coming in contact with it. So in direct application, what we typically see happening from the OSHA perspective is there's an accident with a significant injury on a farm. OSHA comes out and then they will actually apply 1910 against that farm using the general duty clause. So even though you were exempt under 1928, it's something where they're actually applying that 1910 standard, and they've done this for a number of years. So one of the things I always caution farmers that is just because you're exempt from the 1910 standard doesn't mean you shouldn't probably follow it to the best of the ability. Just again, it's good common sense to keep that employee safe. It's good common sense from a liability perspective, but just understanding that you're not really truly exempt from OSHA when it comes to that stuff. The other common one that we run across from an exceptions standpoint is record keeping. So OSHA 300 logs are basically an injury log. Most general industry employers, let's say you work for a manufacturing company, every time somebody is injured and hits a certain threshold, they just jot that information down. They have to record that, and every year they submit a handful of forms. So there's an OSHA 300, OSHA 300A, OSHA 301. These are all different log forms that get submitted on employee injuries. For small employers, and this is regardless if you're a farm or not, if you have 10 or fewer employees, and I'm very specifically stress employees because we have a lot of family operations, it's employees that are getting a W-2. So if you have 10 or fewer of those, you don't have to submit those OSHA 300 logs. If you have 11 to 19 employees, you have to maintain the logs for a period of time just on file. You don't have to send them anywhere. And what that comes into is if there is a situation where OSHA shows up on the farm, they're going to ask for those logs. You have to be able to produce them. If there's 20 or more employees, they have to be submitted electronically every year by March 2nd. So there's kind of a record keeping piece of it. There's also, too, a record keeping piece that if you have an injury of somebody that requires an inpatient of one or more employees overnight, not just a trip to the emergency room. You have an amputation or you have loss of an eye. Those are automatic reportings where you do have to call OSHA within 24 hours. That 800 number is posted all over their website. You do have to notify them. 9 times out of 10, they'll typically come out for those to investigate. Sometimes, depending on what their workload is, they may just go through a questionnaire with you and then follow up at a later date. One of the other exceptions that we see, and this is Wisconsin specific, is as it relates to fuel storage. So anything that's 110 gallons or less that's a gravity dispense tank is exempted from a lot of the standards that are out there, whether it's OSHA, fire code, those types of things. If you add an electric fuel pump to it, it changes things, or if it's more than 110 gallons, it's going to start falling under those other requirements that are out there. There's also specific exemptions for use of fuel tanks mounted to trailers that are taken out to the field for refueling vehicles. So those mobile tank wagons, and again, I'm going to stress mobile tank wagons. We'll see sometimes that somebody will have one of these wagons, or we've started stumbling across where there's the use of fuel tanker trailers that are almost kind of a permanent application. Once they're permanently affixed, the state of Wisconsin is going to take a different perspective on that. Once you're running electrical wiring to it and it's no longer where you can just back up a truck to it, hook up to it, and take off, that changes the dynamic to it. So it's no longer considered a mobile fuel tank, even if it was once that case. Last one I wanted to go through real quick was things that aren't exempt. So fuel tanks, again, this is probably one of the biggest ones that we run into on fuel tanks, is anything that's gasoline has to be 40 feet from any building unless it's in a fuel containment vessel, so a concrete containment vessel. Same thing with diesel. Now, again, the caveat with diesel, the state law permits the insurance company to make exceptions under certain conditions, and we've got kind of a small little list of exceptions that we can make. Basically, if it's not human occupancy or animal occupancy, or it's not kind of principal to the operations of the facility, we can make some exceptions if it's under certain values and some of those things. So, but the state requires that anything be 40 feet or greater from a building unless it's in a fuel containment system. Part of that too is it has to be hardwired. It can't be an extension cord running. It can't be jumper cables to a battery. It has to have impact protection, so either bollards or concrete block that's around it. If it's in concrete containment, that satisfies the impact protection piece of it. And you can get it to within, I think the state statute says within 5 feet of it. From an insurance perspective, I'm like, nah, however close is fine, just because it satisfies a lot of the protective measures that are in place. And the last one that I typically will see that has a bigger exposure on the cranberry farms is the EPA's Spill Prevention Countermeasures and Containment Plan, or SPCC. So what this is anytime that you have petroleum-based products amounting to 1,320 gallons or more that has a reasonable expectation of entering a shoreline area or a navigable waterway, which is really any ditch line, that you have to have an SPCC plan in place. If you have up to 10,000 gallons, you can self-certify that program. The EPA provides some paperwork that you can do that. If it's more than 10,000 gallons, you have to have an engineer come out and help build that program. When they look at that number, the 1,320, that's basically tallying up all of your bulk petroleum products that are in containers of 55 gallons or more. So if you got a bunch of 40-gallon containers laying around, 5 gallon here, it's not like you got to take out the scratch pad and figure, oh, geez, we're over 1,320 gallons. This is really focusing on those fuel tank depots where you've got a bunch of fuel tanks set up. If there's a leak and if it gets into the waterway, that you could have some type of an issue on that. Again, if you have questions on whether or not that applies, we see that more on the cranberry side of it, because if it gets into a marsh, potentially that could be looked at as making its way into a navigable waterway, if the water is discharged out of there without being clean. Or a lot of times you'll have impoundment or rivers and stuff that are close to the marshes as well. So that was a lot of stuff to cover at a 60,000-foot view. So I would encourage you to take down my contact information if there's something real specific that you had a question on. By all means, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help out, or one of my staff members can help out answering any questions that anybody has. But I guess I'll open up the floor if anybody had anything that came to mind right now.
Yeah, hugely appreciated. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or ask in the chat. I also do appreciate all the questions that we had earlier. A lot of times when we're planning these brown bag sessions, the education committee will help me out with, here's a question I had that I'd love someone to address. And so that's how I was able to prepare Chris a little bit for this presentation, or those questions that do come in via email that let Chris do his homework in advance of the call and let us answer them on the fly. But please go ahead and ask those questions via chat or verbally here, or if you take down Chris's information, always feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you as well. I have definitely learned a lot on this call myself, just from things that I'm not usually that plugged into, but really very good to know that we've got people who are deeply plugged in. I think I still want to give it a minute or two, just because I assume there'd be a question or two out there. But if not, I want to thank you very much, Chris. Thank Katie as well for her presentation in the first half of this hour. And as always, and with everything, feel free to reach out when you have questions. I'm very grateful for your time this morning and your expertise in the world of keeping everybody safe and keeping everybody within the realms of what our state statutes let us do. So thank you very much.